As a former national leader, what do you think President Trump will be thinking about in terms of his legacy? What do you think his legacy will be?
Well, and unfortunately, his legacy will be very, very much defined by the events of the last few weeks. You know, the inciting that mob to sack the Capitol, for which he's already been impeached for the second time, will really, it's really the culminating point of a presidency which, while it was not without its achievements, nonetheless sought to exacerbate and the divisions existing in American society. In other words, Trump was the antithesis of what the leader of a multicultural society should be. Instead of trying to bring people together and, find the things they have in common, he sought, for his own political advantage, to exacerbate the divisions in America. And then, of course, running this extraordinary lie about how the election had been stolen, which, of course, a large number of Republicans believed because he told them so. And in that, he was backed up to the hilt by Rupert Murdoch's Fox News. I mean, you can't, Murdoch, in many respects, created Trump. It is as a political leader. It's done a lot of damage, and I think people will sift through his presidency and look for positive steps and achievements, but it is going to be overwhelmingly framed in the context of this extraordinary political chaos that he has left behind him. And the sacking of the Capitol on the 6th of January would have defied the imaginations of the most apocalyptic scriptwriters. But there it was. We saw it happen, and we saw the president send the mob on their way.
Well, I don't think many of us would have predicted a second impeachment as being part of that script either. But, as we head towards that trial, we've been talking about the other options and the necessity for other forms of reform and healing in the US, right? You've spoken at length about the role that you think the media and also social media have played in this. What sort of private sector reforms do you think need to happen?
Well, I think what you're going to see in the US is obviously with a Democratic administration, they will seek to roll back some of the Trump tax concessions to people on higher incomes. They'll clearly need to raise more tax revenue. America is very underinvested in terms of infrastructure. A lot of its, funding models are really misaligned. If you look at the tax base of their cities, I mean, your founder, Mike Bloomberg, of course, knows more about this than anyone, but so much of the revenue base of American cities is based on property taxes, which of course means that the cities that need the most investment, poorer cities, have the lowest revenues. So you look at the way school education is funded in the United States, mostly from property taxes. So affluent areas get the best schools, poorer areas get the worst schools. Much better to do what we do and fund our education, at a state and national level. So, look, I think there's a lot of reforms in America. Interestingly, there's a lot of things America could learn from Australia. I mean, obviously, you look at the electoral system. Compulsory voting's probably too long a bow to draw for the Americans. Their libertarian instincts would resist that. But, the shocking track record of voter suppression there and the racism that underlies it is just terrible. For Australians, I think all regard it as being self-evident that the Australian Electoral Commission's job is to make sure that everybody who is an Australian citizen and an adult is on the electoral roll. And of course, as we know, if you don't turn up on polling day, you'll get a fine unless you've got an excuse. In America, voter suppression, you look at, cases in Georgia where the polling booths in areas with, in largely black areas, people were waiting for hours, and polling booths in predominantly white areas, they were waiting in minutes. I mean, this history of voter suppression is terrible. And I think, I think the problem with that that America that you face is that it naturally polarizes your politics. I mean, our political system is not perfect by any means, but at least by and large, our political debate is around the centre. And compulsory voting helps, independent drawing of electoral boundaries helps. But that's where you want to have the political debate, in the centre, rather than people running off to the extremes. And of course, again, you saw, the ultimate example of that on the 6th of January with all of those crazy peoples with, racists and with Nazi slogans and so forth, trashing the Capitol building.
There's been criticism of the current Prime Minister, though, in terms of his response or measured response. He criticised the violence. He didn't criticise President Trump for his role in inciting that violence. And we're expecting to hear from the opposition leader in Australia later on today. And he's expected to really call that out and say, look, under Scott Morrison, it was a pandering relationship to President Trump. Do you think Australia needs to take a more assertive role when it comes to this dynamic with its strong ally in the US?
Well, look, sycophancy is always a mistake, okay? It is Australian Prime Ministers have typically been Duchessed in Washington and in Beijing too, I might add, and have been inclined to be very, docile and go all the way with LBJ, to quote Harold Holt from many years ago. Obviously, that wasn't the approach I took. I mean, notoriously, whether it was with Beijing or Washington. I believe the best approach is to be forthright and strong and to stand your ground. I firmly believe that you win no respect, but in fact lose respect and influence by being a sycophant or a sucker-up. In the imperial capital, again, whether it's Beijing or Washington, they regard deference as their due. So I always compare it to the shopping scene in Pretty Woman, where the shop assistant asks Richard Gere, would you like some more sucking up? And he says, yes, and obviously some more sucking up follows. That's not what you want to be. As an Australian leader, backslapping sycophancy is not the way to go. You've got to be known, to be strong, to be forthright, to be honest and frank. And if you do that, you win respect. And I think, look, frankly, the reason why I was able to get as good an outcomes as I did with Trump, including ensuring Australia did not have any of the aluminium or steel tariffs or quotas applied to it, and that was quite that was no mean feat. Being able to do that was because I won his respect, and I won his respect by standing up to him and disagreeing with him and taking him on. So I've dealt with big billionaire bullies all my life in one way or another. And, a lot of politicians get dazzled by them and then they just lose influence and respect.
What about Canberra's China strategy? Are you encouraged that if there's a normalisation of relations between Washington and Beijing, obviously there's still going to be the big, competitive strategic dynamic of our time, but if there's a normalisation of that relationship, does Canberra potentially, Australia, stop being the punching bag in between?
Well, look, I think what Beijing is trying to do at the moment is make an example of Australia. They're, putting pressure on Australia to, try to make us be more compliant, right? They did that when I was Prime Minister. I didn't take a backward step, and then the pressure was largely lifted. They backed off. Look, they won't employ a losing strategy indefinitely. The one thing Canberra cannot do is back down. You've got to be careful in your language. There's no point being gratuitous or scratchy or, offensive, if you like. But you cannot take a backward step on matters of principle, on matters of national interest. I think China has massively overreached in its efforts to bully Australia in recent times. I mean, that list of 14 grievances, distributed to the press by the Chinese embassy here was just extraordinary stuff. Look, it's quite counterproductive. I mean, here is the bottom line. Xi Jinping's foreign policy has been much more assertive, you could almost say belligerent, aggressive, than that of his predecessors. It has been utterly counterproductive. China has less influence in the world today than it did before, and it has certainly a lot less affection. People are afeared of China. All of this intimidation is quite counterproductive. And what is so odd to me is that it is clearly only dictated by domestic priorities within China, because it obviously isn't working internationally. I mean, you guys would be talking about this all the time on Bloomberg, I guess, but it has not worked. So presumably this is to cater to a domestic constituency that wants the government to be seen to be, muscling up to the rest of the world. Well, ultimately, foreign policies like business policies and business strategies have got to be judged by their outcomes. And I think this has been quite counterproductive, both in the region and globally.
Right.
There was an opportunity, Heidi, when Trump was president, which of course is now coming to an end, for China to be as unlike Trump as possible. Trump was aggressive, he was erratic, he would be discombobulating close allies 1 minute and sucking up to, adversaries, like Putin the next. I mean, it was all over the shop, okay? So all of that was very unsteadying. Now, that was a time for China to be consistent, respectful, never to overreact, rather than sort of picking up perceived slights and magnifying them, just, letting them go through to the keeper. And if they'd done that, they would have been able to use the Trump years to considerably expand their influence. But they didn't. They did the reverse. They were kind of trying to emulate Trump, and I think that was a big mistake.
I think you're also thinking of that Davos speech that Xi gave that, made everyone think, well, maybe things are going to be different. Before we let you go, we are running short on time, but Prime Minister, are you optimistic that we'll see more action on climate change in Australia if we see more action out of the US, given that President-elect Biden has made it a key agenda priority for his cabinet?
Well, I'm mildly optimistic, but obviously very hopeful. I mean, I think there is a constituency and the Liberal and National parties which is thoroughly, aligned with the sort of Trump, Rupert Murdoch, climate change denial agenda. That's, we're all familiar with that. I think if America rejoins the the Paris Climate Treaty, and you start to get concerted action on climate, and you start to get America and Europe, and I think this will come definitely with Europe, imposing carbon taxes at the frontier. I mean, so we are going to find that emissions-intensive exports are going to be likely penalised. So we've got to I think the time for this crazy business of making something which is a matter of physics, i.e. global warming, a subject of political ideology and identity, that's got to come to an end. Now, because frankly, people in my party and the Liberal Party, many of them felt that they were very aligned with Trump on this climate stuff. They are now utterly at odds with the new administration. So they've got to decide whether they want to be a last, outpost of Trumpism in the Southern Hemisphere. I don't think that's a good place to be.